Have you ever heard any bar teacher say, "Don't repeat the facts"? If so, that's really bad advice and you should ignore it, and in this video I'll explain why. I'm Jackson Mumey, the owner and founder of Celebration Bar Review, and for the past 25 years I've helped thousands of bar takers, people just like you, to make their next bar exam the last bar exam. If you want to know more about how we do that, check out the links on this page after this video. And there's some pretty big false statements that are out there. They're kind of sacred cows in the world of the law and the bar exam. And I've been sort of working systematically through some of them. And in today's discussion, I wanted to talk with you about one of those things that many bar takers swear to me absolutely has to be true. And that's why it becomes such a big myth, because it really isn't. And here's the statement. The instruction and the statement that people believe is, don't repeat the facts on the bar exam. And I think a lot of bar takers today would say, that's absolutely correct. You don't want to use facts. Don't repeat the facts. Examiners don't want to see facts. Don't use them. They're less intellectual. They're less important. But you know, nothing could be further from the truth. The examiners who say, don't repeat the facts, really mean, and where the statement originally came from, was an instruction that said, do not repeat the facts verbatim. Do not write out the entire question before you begin to write your answer. That's what the original instruction was that students have now lost over time. It's gotten perverted over time. Now that statement, that instruction is not the same as don't use the facts. And so I want to take a few minutes to talk about why it's important to write about the facts and to use the facts beyond just the reality that they represent low-hanging fruit on the bar exam. And indeed, it's why I want you to write about the facts first. It's why I want you to use the facts on the multi-state, because often that is the difference between failing and passing the bar exam, those simple answers that are out there for you. Now, the root cause of this discussion comes from the science of how the brain works and how we learn and how we take information in and process it. You see, the brain doesn't really know the difference between fact and fantasy. It's why when you go to the movies and you laugh or you cry, it's not real. It's really just a digital projection up on the screen. But to our brains, this looks and appears real. So we have all of the same responses as though it were a real event happening in real time with us participating. Now, one of the things that we know about how the brain works comes through the use of something called a functional MRI. For a long time, scientists assumed that there were parts of the brain that had different responsibilities, different areas of focus, if you will. There is a part of the brain that is primarily responsible for memorization. That was the theory. And one of the interesting things in the studies that have been done over the last few years is that test subjects were given a list to read or some items to look at for just a few minutes. And then they were inserted into this functional MRI machine, and they were asked to recite back the material that they just read. In other words, to bring back into their brain what they'd memorized. The goal was to see what part of the brain was actually lighting up. Well, what the functional MRIs showed is that one part of the brain in the cortex lights up enormously. It's like this Stranger Things, if you watch that show. It's like, woo, you know, it goes like it's hyperventilating. It's very bright. What scientists perceive and what they understand now is that that part of the brain is taking up a tremendous amount of oxygen to do that work of memorization and recitation. The synaptic responses are literally firing like crazy. Now that creates, for test takers who are trying to memorize rather than using facts, it creates an interesting phenomenon that we would describe as falling asleep while you're sitting up. In other words, people will come back from a test where they've been trying to memorize and recite, and they will say something like, I don't know what happened for the last 10 or 20 or 30 minutes. The time just went by and I don't remember anything occurring. Why does that happen? Well, what we now think the reason is that the brain is drawing off so much oxygen for that part that's required to fire the brain synapses dealing with memorization, that it's actually depriving the rest of the brain of the oxygen that's necessary to retain conscious alertness. Interesting, isn't it? Well, what really interested the test researchers is when they began to work with other subjects, and instead of giving them something to memorize, they actually gave them a fact pattern, like in a bar hypo, a real problem or made up problem, if you will. They then showed the subjects some pictures and they created a visceral emotional reaction to the problem that had been created. Then the researchers put the subjects back into the functional MRI and they asked the subjects a series of questions about what had happened and how to resolve or solve the problem. Now when they map the brain, and the brain mapping is literally a series of lighting points that show up, what they found was a very different pattern than the memorization one. Instead of the memorization centers of the brain lighting up exclusively and everything else being dark, they now found a much more even distribution of brain activity throughout the entire perimeter of the brain. It was much more like a Christmas tree being lit up rather than a flashlight or a spotlight in just one place. Now, what the researchers theorize is happening is that at that point, the subject was actually using more of their brain capacity. They were using their intuitive sense, their logic, their common sense. They're using their problem-solving skills, and they're also using their memory. But they're doing all of that in a much more effective way and more cooperatively in a neurological sense than when they were just trying to memorize. Now, with that very lengthy neurological explanation in mind, the reason that this is so important when it comes to writing facts is that when you go into, let's say, an essay exam, if you begin, as we teach, by writing about the facts first, well, yes, you're helping the reader a little bit by establishing context for what's about to come, but you're mostly helping yourself as the writer. When you start to write about the facts, here's what happens. Your brain gets tricked into believing that it's got a real problem in front of it. You see, if you get this bar hypo and all you do is start reciting and memorizing elements of law from your brain sort of goes into this position of, I'm going to take a break. The memory functions will do the work, and the rest of us are going to go take a cold one. We'll be back in a while. And the problem really becomes that you then have that falling asleep while you're sitting up issue. Now, when the writing problem is put in the context of facts, when you have to write about the facts, now you're sending a different signal to your brain. You're saying, look, this is a real problem. We've got a real problem that needs a real resolution. Now your brain begins to get viscerally engaged in problem solving. And functional MRIs show that the brain is lighting up throughout the entirety of the brain, not just one spot. So as you begin to write about the facts, it now becomes easier to make arguments, to use what you know. If you're a photo reader, as we've talked about in our course, this is much, much easier because now you're bringing out the intuitive side of what you know. Now, what you should know at this point would be the law. If you've done your work and your bar review and your studies, you should know some law. But that's not all you know. You have common sense, you have practical experience, you have life experience, you have common sense, as I said, but intuition about what the right outcome might be. And if you're a problem or a photo reader, that's going to enhance all of those things. The point is that as your brain begins to work through the problem in front of you, you're able to create arguments. And that's critical because as you create arguments, the law that's necessary to support those arguments is much easier to bring to the front because now you're not just trying to bring up the memory in abstract or without context. So, to bring this around full circle, when someone says to you in the bar, don't use the facts or don't repeat the facts, really what they're saying and what you should hear them saying is shut down most of your brain activity and simply go to the part of your brain that just memorizes and recites. But let me ask you this. If you were actually engaged in the practice of law, whether you're a litigator or transactional attorney or mediator, whatever you're doing, doesn't it make sense to you that part of your task, maybe the biggest part of your task, is to help solve your client's problems? It's not just to recite the law back to them or to memorize it. As we've said elsewhere, you can now go to Alexa or Siri or Google or Watson and get that information very, very easily. That's not what you're being hired to do, to give memorized rules. Remember, the job of a lawyer is to be a counselor, to be an advisor. It's to help resolve a problem. And when you're doing all of that, you're actually using all of your brain, which will certainly include what you know about the law. I don't want to suggest for a moment that you don't have to know the law, but you'll also fill in gaps where you might not know it and where you would have to hypothesize or make up what it might be. And that is precisely the skill that the bar examiners are interested in when they give you an essay question. It's not whether or not you can memorize and recite, it's whether or not you can solve problems through your knowledge and use of the law. So when you hear the direction, don't repeat the facts, you really want to avoid that. Run away from it. It's an enormous disservice to you. If you don't use the facts on the bar exam, you're shutting down your brain's capacity to see this as a visceral problem, to use all of your skills. I often suggest to students that they visualize the parties in the hypothetical actually sitting in their office talking to them, engaged in a dialogue, a conversation, or an argument, if you will, about what's happening in the problem. And the more effectively that you can visualize that, the more effectively you'll be able to engage your brain in the idea that this is a real test, a real difficulty and problem, a dispute or a conflict that needs a real resolution. So writing about the facts is nothing other than a prelude to being able to write about the law. Now, if you're just starting out in the course, we're going to talk a great deal about how to do that. We're going to show you exactly how to do it. And I've seen this work in every exam, in every jurisdiction that we prepare students for. Now, no question, this is controversial. There are lots of people who say, oh, you know, that guy Mumey, he just wants to do fact stuff. He just writes about the facts. Well, that's not true. You're going to write plenty of law in your answer. But the interesting thing about the facts is that they're always in front of you, and they're a great place to start. They're a terrific way to prime your pump, to get your motor running. And when you get your mental motor running, it's much easier then to move to what people think of as the bar exam test, which is a discussion of the law. You see, I think that if you don't use the facts, you're never going to really reach that point. It's going to be very dangerous and very difficult for you to reach the level of making good arguments. And so I think one of the most dangerous myths that's out there is the myth of don't repeat the facts. The reality here is that you have to use them. You have to use them all the time. You have to read the fact pattern in a multi-state question. You have to read the facts in an essay or a performance test, and you have to use them as deeply as you need to get yourself into the problem and to be able to solve the problem by showing the law that you know. And it's really just that simple.